Good evening. My name is Rabbi Yitzchok Tiechtel with Chabad of Nashville, and welcome to another edition of Parsha Perspectives. As you all know, Parsha Perspectives is a lesson, it's an insight into the weekly Torah portion, and at times the Jewish calendar, based on the teachings of Chassidus and Jewish mysticism. And every week we come together to learn and find a message that is related to our own personal journey to live a life filled with meaning and purpose. They tell a joke about a woman who sees her coworker wearing her wedding ring on her thumb. So she says, "Excuse me, but you're wearing your ring on the wrong finger." And her friend replies, "Aha, that's because I'm married to the wrong man." Not a very good joke. But they ask a question: why should a single man and woman bind themselves together to live life forever? When, for whatever reason, they do make a commitment of a big wedding, why make such a big deal out of it? I mean, why make a big celebration with invitations and nice dresses and a venue and a caterer and a florist and a band and on and on? I mean, why announce it to the whole world? Why can't two people just live together when it feels right, without fanfare and all the hoopla and all the excitement? And if it doesn't work out, you just move out. Why the need to the whole thing, commitment thing, a ring and a ceremony, etc.? I mean, in any other arena, no normal person would sign for a lifelong contract. If they sign any contract at all, it would be a year or 2 years. Let's evaluate in a period of time. Yet when it comes to marriage, we do precisely that. Now, while many people, especially young people, ask this question, people continue to marry. And even in this progressive world, studies prove that even while 40% of young Americans believe marriage is outdated, yet nevertheless 95% of young people plan to marry. Why? And what's even more interesting perhaps is that it's not just a question of traditional values. The truth is that thousands of years ago, before the Torah was even given, do you know that marriage really wasn't a thing? Maimonides actually writes in the beginnings of the laws of marriage, he says, before the Torah was given, if a man walked in the street, he saw a beautiful woman, he met her, and he decided to marry her, he would just bring her home, they would conduct relations in private, and thus she'd become her wife. Yet then, Maimonides continue, that once the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, the Jewish people were actually commanded that when a man desires to marry a woman, he must acquire her as a wife in the presence of two witnesses. And only after this does she become his wife. And the Rambam, Maimonides, brings to mind a fascinating fact. He says the entire book of Genesis, which contains the entire story of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, when they were building a nation from scratch, we don't find any concept of chuppah, a marriage contract, or even a wedding ring. In the union of the patriarchs and matriarchs, the Torah speaks simply about the man bringing the woman to live with him in her home, or living together and having children, as it says by Yitzchak and Rivka, Isaac and Rebecca, Vayavaya ahela. He brought her into her tent, and she was his wife to him, and he loved her. That's it. The Torah doesn't talk anything about a ceremony, about a chuppah. And even in the case of Jacob, Laban, his uncle, takes it a step further. He throws a big party for the marriage of his daughters to Jacob. But still, there was no mention of any ceremony or a contract or any commitment to live together in a holy matrimony, to live forever together. The first time the mitzvah of marriage appears in the Torah is in the book of Deuteronomy, in this week's Torah portion, Parshat Kiteitzei. This portion contains more mitzvot than all the portions of the whole Torah. There are 74 mitzvot in this week's portion, and 2 of them deal with marriage and divorce. And the verse says, when a man takes a woman as a wife, and he is intimate with her. In other words, what does it mean? Before a man and a woman can live together as a husband and wife, there must be some form of what we call taking. There must be a transaction which the husband incorporates and establishes the woman to be his wife. That taking actually connotes acquisition. It's actually derived from the story In Genesis, when Abraham purchases a cave in Hebron, the Machpelah, to bury his wife, the one he buys it from is called Ephron. And he claimed he was willing to give the field to Abraham for free, the cave to bury his wife. But Abraham said, no. I am giving money for the field. Take it from me. And the purchase there was called taking. And likewise, the process by which a man and a woman become husband, it's vayikacheha, which means in Hebrew, and he takes her in. So what are we saying? We're saying, in other words, they are a transaction that's binding, that lives forever together. Once taking is performed, no party can just simply make their way out of it and say, oops, I made a mistake, I'm out of here. Rather, they're bound by a bond of mutual trust and loyalty. Yet on the flip side, the Torah continues to tell us how this bond may be severed. If, God forbid, if it happens that she doesn't find favor in his eyes, or vice versa, he would write her a bill of divorce and place it into her hand, and they send her away from his house. In other words, what that simply means is that if things don't work out, God forbid, one can't just say goodbye, which how it worked before the Torah was given. Rather, you need another transaction to undo the first one. There must be a get, which means a bill of divorce. Again, it's called a get, and it's in this week's Parsha. Now, you may ask, why does the Torah have to complicate things? Before the Torah was given, many upright people did just fine without this institution of marriage. When it worked, they lived together, they raised families. When it didn't, they parted ways and moved on. Why does the Torah require this whole concept of acquisition and a lifelong commitment? And if it fails, God forbid, you have to go through a highly painful transaction. It's very emotional for the dissolution of the marriage, God forbid. Now, of course, there's the popular view that marriage is like a safeguard. It's an incentive for the relationship between man and woman, that once you have a public wedding ceremony, costing who knows how much in today's dollars, there might be a little bit of a hesitance before bailing out of the marriage. Because look at that big ceremony and celebration that just took place. But we're talking about marriage as an institution of the Torah, a holy, an eternal, a divine institution. Obviously, the Torah concept of marriage is far more than causing a person to think twice before ending it. As we shall actually see, that the institution of marriage actually serves a very important and meaningful purpose indeed. I want to share with you a profound teaching of the Rebbe that was shared in 1989, which actually is written in the Likutei Sichos, volume 89. It's one of the books over here in the library. And he writes, for a person to receive the maximum, he or she must give the maximum. Minor achievements, he says, may be attained with minor investment. But to have an absolute success, a bold, meaningful ventures, absolute bold, meaningful commitments must be made. As such commitments demand that a person lock himself in and summon the deepest resources that's in the person. To understand the profundity of marriage, we go back to the very first couple. Who were they? Adam and Eve. Now, unlike all other creatures on earth, Adam and Eve were created as a single body. It says, Zachar and Akeva bar Osam. Only after their creation did God separate them into a man and a woman, Ish and Isha. What does that mean? It means that really, a man and a woman are not a man and a woman that are two separate people, but they're really a single entity. It's a complete human being. It's not that they have two hands. It's like in a way they have four hands. They're a couple. They're one. The separation, when they're born, they're two halves. And that helps them be productive in this world. And they each one develop themselves independently. But there comes a time when these two halves must reunite. And no other species work that way. Because, animals don't marry. They mate. It is no more essentially than doing a business deal. There's no relationship or a soul bond. It's a mutual evolutionary instinct to do what it takes to keep the species alive for another generation. But friends, marriage in humans is so much deeper. It's two people sharing one life, dreaming one dream, feeling one feeling. It's two halves of one separated for 20 or 30 years. And then they come together and become whole again. Kabbalah explains that a husband and wife are two halves of a soul divided at birth. at marriage, they reunite. There's a beautiful book called the Sefer HaArikaim, and it states that the word love in Hebrew, ahava, has the same numerical value as echad, one. Because true love is the process of two parts becoming one. There's something fascinating in the Torah's description of God's creation of the world. We find that during the creation, God repeatedly looked at his handiwork, everything he created, and he was satisfied. And every time he says, Vayar Elokim ki tov, and God saw it was good. Yet there was only one time where God looked and saw that it was not good. When God created the first human being, the Torah says, and God said, it's not good for a man to be alone. I will make him a helpmate opposite him. What the Torah is telling us, that loneliness more than anything else is not good, because to be lonely is to be a half a person, to lose half of a person's potential. And that is untenable for a creation of God. I mean, why should a man and a woman live together at all? You know why, friends? Because it's the only way to live with themselves. Without together, each half is incomplete. Together as one is the only way to achieve maximum potential. And this, my friends, is where commitment of marriage comes into the picture. Because if the marriage is going to succeed, if the project is going to pay off, it must have two wings. And the two wings are love and commitment. Without love, you can't take off. But without commitment, you can't remain in the sky for very long. Yet, commitment is often frowned upon these days. The truth is, commitment is actually the engine that makes the world function. I committed to getting that degree, so I have no choice but to turn in the paper when it's due. I committed to my job, so I have no choice but to fulfill my responsibilities. I committed to feed my family, so I have no choice. I got to go out there, make something of it, and make sure they have bread on the table and taken care of. Why is that? Because commitment is actually what forces us to summon our deepest resources that's within, to overcome natural laziness, to ignore the natural short-sightedness that one may have, and actually to make a difference in this world. Friends, the institution of marriage works the same way. When a husband and wife make that binding commitment, they now have no choice but to make it work. And in their quest to make it work, they will actually, you know what's going to happen? They're going to discover resources that's within themselves that they really didn't know they even had. And this commitment is what gives us the strength and even the chutzpah to rise above our own ego and to get in touch with a deeper, truer, and more complete version of ourselves. And this is actually what motivates us to make the investment and to make sure the investment succeeds. Allow me to tell you something personal. In the early years of marriage, when we lived in Brooklyn, New York, in an apartment building, in the apartment across from us lived a couple. They weren't married. They were around the same age as my wife and myself. And many times after Shabbat, after visiting my parents, I would come back home. We used to have Shabbos meals there, and we would come back home. And we had a little daughter in a carriage. And it was the same time that this couple, they were coming back from their vacation or their weekend, wherever they went, to Manhattan, or they went out. And I'm embarrassed to admit that sometimes I felt a little bit like a jealousy. We were the same age, yet they are free. Well, I might have been a bit tired. And, just you look at them and you say, wow, I wish I can do that. One evening, I was walking down the steps to take out the trash to where we went. I heard crying. I really heard like sobbing. And I saw my neighbor sitting on the side, on the stairs. She was weeping. It turned out they just broke up, not in the nicest fashion. And at that moment, I understood that to succeed in life, you need to have these two guideposts. You need love and you need commitment. The love allows you to take off to soar, and the commitment allows you to remain steady, even through the turbulence, to stay on the flight path and reach the destination. I want to share with you two short stories about the Rebbe and his wife, called the Rebbitzin, that actually illustrate us the kind of commitment that the Torah envisions for the holy institution of marriage. The first story, the Rebbe's wife, called the Rebbetzin Chaimushka, she once injured her foot badly one Friday, and she was instructed by her doctor to stay off her feet for a while. But she didn't want to be a burden upon the Rebbe with this development that just happened. So she had to come up with a way to serve the Shabbat meal that Friday night without the Rebbe noticing that she wasn't really walking. She didn't want to burden the Rebbe with this challenge she had. So she asked the assistant in the home, his name was Rabbi Halberstam, he was a helper in the Rebbe's home, to prepare the first course, the fish and the salad, on the table before the Rebbe came home from shul. Like this, the Rebbe wouldn't see that she's not serving the food because the food is already on the table. The Rebbe comes home and he saw that his wife, the Rebbetzin, was sitting in her place by the table. He didn't say a thing. They ate the first course, they sang a Shabbat song, but then came the time to serve the next course. Here was the moment of truth. Usually the Rebbetzin would stand up and clear the table, and she would go bring the soup to the table. The Rebbe's helper, Rabbi Halberstam, he was out of the room to give them their space, and he was looking to see, what is the Rebbetzin going to do now? I mean, how could they serve the food without the Rebbe noticing that the Rebbetzin was still sitting down? He couldn't come in and bring the food, because then the Rebbe would notice that she's not feeling well. And at that moment, the Rebbe began singing a beautiful Hasidic melody called Azamer B'Shvachim. And the Rebbe closed his eyes. And he was singing intently with great meditation, like the Rebbe was in a different world. He was great joy, but it wasn't there. He wasn't there spiritually. And quickly, the Rebbe's assistant, Rabbi Halberstam, cleared the fish plates and brought out the soup. And as soon as he finished serving the food, the Rebbe opened his eyes without having seen what happened. He wanted to protect his wife's dignity. Another story that took place after the Rebbetzin passed away. The Rebbe sat Shiva. He was mourning his wife in his home. And many people, he would have the service downstairs and people came to visit. And then he would go up to his room upstairs privately. The Rebbe's secretary, who's my uncle, Rabbi Groner of blessed memory, he would always remain on the first floor. And he was ready to serve the Rebbe if the Rebbe needed anything from upstairs. One night, the door opened and in walked one of the nurses who wasn't Jewish. And she used to help the Rebbetzin, the Rebbe's wife, when she was alive. The woman began to cry. The Rebbe's assistant, Rabbi Groner, empathized with her. I'm sure you're sad. The Rebbe lost his wife. She's a great woman. But the woman said, I'm actually crying for the Rebbe. Because when he would come home at night, he had a burden of the world on his shoulders. Everybody wrote him letters with their issues. And it was a big load to carry. But then he would sit down for a cup of tea every night. He had a cup of tea with his wife. And he would feel like a new sense of energy would come through him. His face would shine. The Rebbe would share his burdens of life with the Rebbetzin. And now he has no one to talk to. On a similar note, the Rebbe once asked this question. He says, before Jacob's passing, Joseph's sons came to get a blessing from Jacob, Ephraim and Manasseh. But it says, Yisrael saw the sons of Yosef. And he said to Joseph, he saw his sons, said, who are they? Yosef said to his father, these are my sons, God gave me here. At this point he says, bring them to me so I can bless them. And the Rebbe asks, Jacob lived for 17 years with his grandkids in Egypt. Why was he suddenly wondering, who are these? And when Yosef answered him, why did he suddenly say, oh, now I understand. And what does it mean when Yosef said, these are the sons that God gave me? What did Yosef mean? Rashi says that at that moment Yaakov felt the divine presence leave him, and he wondered if the people standing in front of him were actually worthy of blessing. And he was forced to have an uncomfortable question to ask, who are these? Under what circumstances were they born to you? What did Yosef say when his father asked that question? Yosef said, they are my sons who God gave me here. And Rashi says, Yosef showed his father his marriage contract, the ketubah, when he married his wife. It seems that Yosef was the first person in history to actually enter his marriage the way we know it, with a contract, with a ketubah, with a binding lifelong commitment to stay together and build a Jewish home. But why, you may ask, was it Yosef of all people who was the first one to do this? Why did Yosef have to be more religious than his grandfather Abraham, Isaac, and his father Jacob? They didn't have a marriage contract. Yet, friends, the answer is that Yosef was looking for a way to strengthen his marriage, because he knew that he was here. He said, these children are born to me here in Egypt. He knew Egypt was an immoral place. It was the kind of place where a young slave immediately, he was almost seduced by his master's wife. Yet Abraham and Sarah, they also came to Egypt in the book of Genesis. And they also experienced Egyptian immorality when the king abducted Sarah. And when he released her, the king said to Abraham, here is your wife, take and go and leave. And Rashi explains that Pharaoh knew Abraham and Sarah couldn't remain in Egypt because the Egyptians are promiscuous. They don't live holy lives. Think about it. Abraham and Sarah, they were an older couple, and they couldn't contend with the evils of Egypt. And here Joseph is a young man. Decades later, he's a fine-looking, handsome guy who all the young women in Egypt tried to get a glimpse of him. In this climate, how is he supposed to establish a home that is based on principles of modesty and righteousness? So what did he do? He had to raise his standards. And he did this by writing a ketubah, a marriage contract that binding himself with an absolute commitment to his wife. And this commitment added tremendous holiness and purity to their union. And when Jacob heard about it, he said, now, my son, the blessings will come forth. And at the conclusion of the Rebbe's talk on this topic, he shared a very practical, wonderful idea. He said, as mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the laws of marriage, which is in Maimonides' book called Nashim, the laws related to holiness and women, Maimonides discusses the difference between marriage before the Torah was given and after the Torah was given, as mentioned earlier. Yet the book before that is called Zmanim, which that comes before the laws of marriage. And there Maimonides ends the book with a quote, peace is great, for the entire Torah was given to bring about peace within the world. As it states, its ways are pleasant ways, and its paths are peace. And that's why there should be peace in this world between God and man and God. And just as the Talmud always looks for connections between the end of one tractate in Talmud and the other, the Rebbe said, here's a connection between Maimonides, the end of the third book, called Zmanim, where he says, its ways are pleasant ways and its paths are peace. And immediately after that, he goes into the laws of marriage. What does the Rebbe say? The Rebbe says, when you say ways, its ways are pleasant ways, it means like a wide highway, traveled by many people. But when you say its paths are pleasant, paths are like a narrow path. It's just for a few people. He says, in the Torah, there are two approaches. There's the narrow path of mitzvot, in which the aim is spiritual growth, a relationship between man and God. But then there's the broad approach, its ways, in which the Torah brings a wealth of richness into a person's holistic, physical, spiritual, personal, and professional and communal life, making it more spiritual, making all of those paths, those ways more meaningful in every aspect of our life and in all ways. Because if it's done properly, Torah and mitzvot actually transform everything in life that we do today to be richer, to be more powerful. And he says that's what the verse says. Its ways are pleasant ways. Most of the mitzvahs are just not paths, but they're ways. They lead not only to some narrow spiritual reward, but it enriches life. It makes life more pleasant in the simple sense. And that's how the book of Zmanim culminates, and the laws of marriage follow by explaining how this happens. Because Maimonides begins the laws of marriage by showing us an example of this principle as it applies to the laws of marriage. One can't compare marriage before the Torah was given and after. Because marriage after the Torah was given, the marriage of commitment, the marriage of responsibility is based on the fact that its ways are pleasant ways. It's a path to a much richer life, in which all of us can overcome all the challenges of two people binding their lives together to reach their true potential as one. So prior to Sinai, relationships were like a path one took. It was a narrow path just to survive in this challenging world like Joseph did. Maybe coming spiritually closer, but physically, really, everything remained the same. There were no holistic or comprehensive, all-inclusive way. There was merely the path of spiritual survival. Yet after Mount Sinai, marriage became a way. Marriage became the way to change the world. For all the material, all the spiritual, they actually, material and spiritual, became one. So when we marry, we make a commitment to build the home based on Torah and on mitzvot. Under the chuppah, the canopy of marriage, the bride and groom are blessed to live a life filled with love, camaraderie, peace, and friendship. Each of these four elements are important for a marriage to survive and thrive. Love is felt some days more than others. But friendship, friends, is a covenant. It's a bond. Friendship is a commitment that the bride and groom will always be there for one another, regardless of the trials and tribulations that life brings them. The couple is committed as a husband and wife to support one another. It's what we call an everlasting covenant, an unbreakable bond. And so too with another relationship, which is the relationship with the Almighty God. As we say, God is considered the bride and we, the Jewish people, are the groom. And when I have a relationship with God, as a covenant, it's unbreakable. And then God is committed to us, despite all the ups and downs that we face in life. Because God truly loves us, and He wants the best for us now and forever. So friends, as we culminate the year in just a few short weeks, let us work on strengthening our marriage and our relationship with the one above. And no doubt that He will bless us in return, that we have an even stronger bond of love and relationship in our own home with our loved ones and our family. May we be married very soon to see the moment of the ultimate marriage, the cosmic marriage of heaven and earth, celebrated under the sublime chuppah with the coming of Mashiach. May it happen speedily in our days. Shalom.